rigged the vote, making Karzai's supporters determined to ensure that the president won on the first ballot. Meanwhile, throughout the summer of 2009, the Taliban were on the offensive, intent on disrupting the election. In the first 6 months of that year, their attacks had soared by 60% over 2008. In a single week in June, Taliban attacks had killed 250 civilians and soldiers in 25 provinces. Afghanistan has 34 provinces. It was the widest, deepest, and bloodiest Taliban offensive so far, and their control had expanded to nearly half of Afghanistan's 364 districts. The critical battlegrounds were the two southern provinces of Kandahar and Helmand, which had large Pashtun populations. Karzai and his supporters were Pashtun, which was the largest ethnic group, and traditionally a Pashtun had always ruled the country. Karzai needed Pashtun votes, but Taliban violence threatened to keep the Pashtuns from coming out to vote. In the 1990s, the Taliban, most of whom were also Pashtun, had butchered many non-Pashtuns in the north and west, but now the north was relatively peaceful. Turnout in the non-Pashtun areas was expected to be high, which could make the future parliament ethnically unbalanced and hurt Karzai's vote. So U.S. Marines and British soldiers undertook a large-scale offensive in Helmand to drive out the Taliban so the Pashtuns there could vote safely. The fighting was heavy. In early July, 8 British soldiers were killed in 24 hours. 47 Americans were killed in August, the deadliest month in the war for the U.S. military. These soldiers' deaths were portrayed in their home media as deaths for the sake of a free and fair Afghan election. On August 20th, Election Day, the turnout was just 38%, far less than what it had been in 2004. Few people in the South actually turned out to vote. Local officials and Karzai tribal loyalists stuffed ballot boxes where nobody voted and even created hundreds of fake polling stations that recorded thousands of votes. In one district, polling stations were opened for an hour, then closed, and then all 23,900 ballots were forged for Karzai. Actual voter turnout in the Pashtun South was estimated at between 1 and 5%. But high-intensity ballot stuffing for Karzai at some polling stations recorded more than 100% turnout. The Taliban inflicted some damage. They killed 26 Western and Afghan soldiers in 73 attacks, but they could not disrupt the election. But the rigging defied even the worst expectations. In the previous months, Karzai had aligned himself with warlords, drug traffickers, and provincial officials who were terrified of losing their lucrative jobs. In 2004, the UN had had control over the election, but this time, Karzai had demanded that the UN hand over control to the Afghan-run Independent Election Commission, IEC, which was beholden to Karzai, as he appointed its members. The international community's biggest mistake was to agree to this demand. Some UN and US diplomats warned of massive rigging but were not listened to. Within a day of the election, Karzai's aides were claiming outright victory, while Abdullah, who believed he had won the right to a runoff election, pointed out the fraud and painted a bleak picture if the West did not recognize it. The foundations of this country have been damaged by this fraud, throwing it open to all kinds of consequences, including instability, he said on August 29th. It is true that the Taliban are the first threat, but an illegitimate government would be the second. On September 8th, the Electoral Complaints Commission, which included UN members, declared that it had found clear and convincing evidence of fraud. It threw out more than 1 million suspicious votes and ordered a recount of 10% of the returns that had led Karzai to claim he had won the election. But Karzai refused to participate in a runoff second vote against Abdullah, even if the results showed that one was needed. It took 4 days of persuasion by half a dozen top U.S. officials, including Holbrooke and Senator John Kerry, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, before Karzai would agree to a runoff. The recount was completed on October 20th, 2 months after the election. Karzai received 49.7% of the vote and now faced a runoff against Abdullah, who had won 30.5%. On November 1st, citing the inappropriate actions of the government and the election commission, Abdullah announced that he would not participate in the second round. Karzai had won his second term as president, but the political price that he, his government, the international community, the UN, and the United States would pay was heavy. Karzai never offered an apology, never showed any remorse for the rigging, and never offered reconciliation to those Afghans who had been defrauded of their votes. All this would have an enormous negative effect on the transition from US and NATO forces to Afghan forces. The political crisis continues to this day, with no resolution in sight. The election would undermine the very surge that had been designed to protect it. Countries hostile to the U.S. presence, such as Iran and Pakistan, saw the election as Obama's failure, as did the Taliban and their supporters. By declining to hold Karzai accountable for the elections, the United States had strengthened him immeasurably. He now believed he could get away with anything. The U.S. assumption that he was a weak leader was wrong. He had become a strong president in a weak or barely existent national system. Once again, the Taliban took advantage of the political crisis, launching a series of attacks in Kabul. A suicide attack on the U.S. Embassy on August 15, 2009, killed 8 people and wounded more than 100. The worst attack came on October 28th. 11 people in a UN guest house in Kabul, including 5 UN officials, were killed in a prolonged gun battle. Unfortunately, the international community conducted no post-mortem on the election, so when the parliamentary elections came around a year later, nothing had been learned or rectified, and no plan was made to deal with Karzai's determination to overrule the election's institutional mechanisms. Karzai again insisted on holding the parliamentary elections on time, on September 18, 2010. He wanted the elections to produce a more pliant parliament that would have a Pashtun majority, accept his plans to talk to the Taliban, and endorse his cabinet. Parliament had the right to reject the president's choices for cabinet ministers. Rigging took place on a large scale, by individual candidates, many of whom the government indirectly helped. To its lasting credit, this time around Karzai's hand-picked IEC, which oversaw the poll, acted fairly. It invalidated 1.33 million votes for fraud, or nearly a quarter of the 5.74 million votes cast, and in mid-November it disqualified 24 candidates who had been unofficially declared winners, including a cousin of the president. The IEC had asserted itself, but left behind an intractable problem. Due to the renewed Taliban threats, turnout among the Pashtuns was very low, as a result of which the Pashtuns lost 20% of their seats to ethnic minorities, especially the Tajiks and Hazaras, in provinces where ethnic groups were mixed. In the last parliament, Pashtuns had held 129 seats out of 249, but now they were down to just 94 seats, well short of a majority. All 11 seats in the important province of Ghazni, which has a mixed Pashtun-Hazara population, were won by Hazaras, a result that infuriated the Pashtuns and Karzai. Ghazni's results were delayed, which resulted in a long, bitter dispute between the IEC and Karzai's officials, and public protests took place. Yunus Kanuni, the Speaker of the outgoing parliament and a prominent leader of the Tajik faction, described the elections as a process of selection because some of Karzai's advisers did not get the results they wanted. But now that the government has held the elections, he added, it cannot undermine its own elections by trying to nullify them. Stefan de Mistura, the UN Special Representative, tried hard to find a compromise but failed, and relations between Karzai and the international community again deteriorated. When I met with Karzai in Kabul in December 2010, he clearly felt trapped and was seriously considering declaring the elections null and void, which would have created an even bigger crisis. He delayed the opening of the parliament, fearing a non-Pashtun majority that would reject any peace deal with the Taliban, amend the constitution to change from a presidential system to a parliamentary system, and reduce Karzai's own powers. The standoff continued until January 20, 2011, when the UN, the United States, and the European Union jointly expressed deep concern at Karzai's failure to open parliament and threatened that if the delay continued, they could not justify their expenditures on Afghanistan. Karzai finally backed down and opened parliament, 4 months after the elections had taken place. Ultimately, a kind of solution was found. The IEC dismissed 9 members of parliament on account of fraud and replaced them with another 9 who were acceptable to Karzai, but more than half of parliament refused to accept the new members. Parliament remained frozen and ineffective for more than a year after the elections. The legislative machinery ground to a halt, even though the parliament was and is needed to endorse a full cabinet for Karzai, to help bail out the Kabul bank, which had given its shareholders large unsecured loans and lost hundreds of millions of dollars, as a result of which the country now faced the disruption of aid flows from the IMF, and to endorse any post-2014 strategic agreement with the United States. The entire legislative machinery remains at a halt in the fall of 2011. The lack of fair elections, the inequitable distribution of seats among ethnic groups, the war, and the continued economic deprivation have only intensified Afghanistan's long-running and unresolved ethnic problems. The divisions between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtun nationalities that make up the complex weave of the Afghan national carpet remain deeply entrenched. The corruption and incompetence of the Karzai administration are still seen to benefit the Pashtuns. U.S. counterinsurgency and development spending had focused heavily on the Pashtun provinces, where the Taliban insurgency was strongest, to the neglect of those dominated by ethnic minorities in the north and west. Non-Pashtuns remain furious that an estimated 70% of all development funds are being spent in just 2 provinces in the south, Helmand and Kandahar. Meanwhile, the talks between the Karzai government and the Taliban have galvanized non-Pashtuns to mount a fierce resistance led by the Tajiks, who oppose the secret talks with the Taliban and are unwilling to share power with them. The Taliban butchered them less than a decade ago and helped al-Qaeda murder their leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud. A strong grassroots movement has emerged among the non-Pashtuns that is critical of both Karzai and the Taliban. Left largely to their own devices, the Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, and Turkoman minorities have achieved some success, which stirs anger and resentment among the Pashtuns. For the first time, Tajiks and Hazaras dominate the higher officer class in the army and police because not enough Pashtuns, the traditional officer class, are being recruited. U.S. recruitment policy includes a strict ratio established in 2003 among all ethnic groups. Thus, Tajiks could not be over 25% in the army, but in 2010 they constituted some 41% of soldiers and officers in the army, while Tajik officers commanded 70% of the units. Pashtun recruitment stood at only 30%, compared to the 38% it should be, and 50% of the Pashtuns recruited were from the peaceful western provinces of Nimroz and Farah, which are not considered to be the Pashtun bastions. Or, seen in another dimension, the southern and eastern Pashtun-dominant provinces of Kandahar, Helmand, Zabul, Uruzgan, Paktika, and Ghazni, where the Taliban are strongest, make up 17% of Afghanistan's population, but since 2009, only 1.5% of the army's soldiers have been recruited from there. Kandahar and Helmand have contributed only 1,200 soldiers since 2009, or less than 1% of 173,000 enlistees in that period. Uruzgan has yielded a total of 14 recruits in the same period. Clearly, the rapid U.S. buildup of the security forces has been a major boon to the minorities, but the new Afghan army cannot defeat the Taliban without more Pashtuns in its units, and Pashtuns are unlikely to be recruited as long as they are intimidated by the Taliban. The non-Pashtuns who dominate the north and west have also linked up with their neighboring states to open up road and trade networks, import electricity and gas, develop mineral extraction, and create other profitable businesses. Those benefiting are Iran and the Central Asian states of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Herat, in the northwest, has forged links with Iran that have turned it into the country's most prosperous province. The same goes for Mazar-e-Sharif's links with Uzbekistan. Afghanistan's drug trade, 50% of which travels through Iran and Central Asia, has also enriched local warlords and politicians. All this has improved lives for ordinary people in the northwest, provided independent sources of wealth for local elites that are not dependent on Kabul, and widened the ethnic rift. The Pashtuns in the south and east, by contrast, are stuck with their powerful neighbor Pakistan, which supports the Taliban with money and arms, but has done little to encourage trade or development, provide aid, or improve Afghan Pashtun lives. Pakistan, mired in its own poverty, deficient in energy and water, has little to offer the Pashtuns. Some Tajik and Uzbek warlords in the north have become so rich and powerful that they now barely listen to Karzai. Governors there have created their own fiefdoms and maintain their own militias that NATO forces based there do not touch. The most powerful man in the country after Karzai is probably the little-known Atta Muhammad Nur, a Tajik general who once fought the Taliban and who is now the governor of Balkh province, bordering Uzbekistan. Karzai would like to remove him but cannot do so, fearing a backlash. Similarly, the Uzbek general Ahmed Rashid Dostum, despite being out of favor with Kabul and the United States, made a comeback in the 2009 elections with the support of the Uzbeks. Obama ordered the first U.S. surge troops into Afghanistan to protect the election and to widen the appeal of the government. The failure of the Afghan electoral process has not only nullified that agenda, it has endangered the very process of transition and the exit of Western forces, weakened the government's authority, and diminished Karzai's standing, while it has contributed to ethnic and political polarization inside Afghanistan that could eventually erupt into another civil war. Ultimately, Obama's authority and the U.S. reputation of being able to find its way through the Afghan thicket have both taken a beating. Chapter 5. Afghanistan, Political and Military Fault Lines. If anything undermined President Obama's entire Afghan deployment, it was the failure to develop a comprehensive political strategy that the U.S. military could not delay or even hold hostage. In 2010, Obama decided to deploy 33,000 additional U.S. troops as part of a surge and militarily attempt to roll back the Taliban insurgency. Doing so, while at the same time setting a deadline for their return home by 2014, was a strategy fraught with risks and potential failure. Despite the euphoria in military circles about the new counterinsurgency strategy that the extra troops could now pursue, important issues were left unaddressed. The Obama formula for Afghanistan failed to do several things: encourage Pakistan to change its policy of harboring the Taliban, build up an indigenous Afghan economy, start talks with the Taliban parallel to the military surge, and persuade Karzai to improve governance and end corruption. Not a single senior U.S. official on the Obama team had a trusting relationship with Karzai. Lacking a reliable political partner in either Kabul or in Islamabad, Obama was more dependent on the U.S. military for his policy's outcome. Obama's greatest success, using funds made available by Congress, was to rapidly build the Afghan security forces to 350,000 men. But whether these undertrained and illiterate Afghan forces could hold the country together once the Americans left was always debatable. Wars cannot be won through military means alone, especially when the occupying forces are trying to exit the country in the midst of an insurgency. Before Obama was elected president, his admirers viewed him as a practical visionary who had seen the world, knew how it worked, and promised to move U.S. policy away from the ideological blinders of the Bush administration. Common sense and reality, not grand rhetoric, would prevail. Obama's most influential foreign policy advisers were also expected to provide realistic assessments of conditions on the ground. Thomas Donilon, the National Security Advisor, who replaced General James Jones, his deputy Dennis McDonough, and Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, the soft-spoken senior White House advisor on Afghanistan, who had also served Bush. They all believed that the United States needed to extricate itself from both Iraq and Afghanistan. So what happened? Obama was utterly trapped by the Bush legacy of failures in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2008, and by the power and authority of the U.S. military establishment after September 11th. It became arbiter, driver, and decider of U.S. foreign policy. Obama's cold sense of reality could not free itself from the Pentagon's way of thinking or doing. Another factor was more parochial. Those around him feared that the first black, and Democratic to boot, president might be taken for a wimp when it came to dealing with the world, so Obama had better act tough and be just as militaristic as any Republican president. In his election campaign, Obama had promised to do more for Afghanistan, both to end the war and to help develop the nation. Once in office, he immediately increased funds for economic and social development and sent civilian experts to build up the economy. Bush had done very little, as I painfully appraised in Descent into Chaos. According to a study by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Bush administration spent a total of $10.7 billion between 2002 and 2008 on economic development in Afghanistan. Obama spent $7 billion in 2009 and $10 billion in 2010 alone, but only $3.2 billion in 2011 as the recession continued in the United States. Richard Holbrooke tried hard, but in the midst of a countrywide insurgency, he could not develop an indigenous economy, let alone one that could stand up to the shock of a Western troop withdrawal. The World Bank, in a 2011 report, said that 97% of Afghanistan's economy was related to international military spending, and that once troops pulled out, it would experience a massive depression. Despite Obama's overarching commitments to Afghanistan, the U.S. military read his program to mean just one thing: more troops, which had been unobtainable while the Iraq War was at its height. Such was the expectancy of a rapid increase in U.S. troops that bases were being built even before troop numbers had been agreed upon. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton helped the military by always siding with the generals. She agreed with the Pentagon on every major decision on Afghanistan, rather than listen to her own advisor and mentor, Richard Holbrooke. Holbrooke opposed the troop buildup and pushed for resolving the Pakistan conundrum, negotiating with the Taliban, and helping Afghanistan and Pakistan with their economies. Unlike the military, he did not see defeating the Taliban as an option. The White House snubbed Holbrooke, even though his views were somewhat similar to those of Obama's advisors. But they hated him, and Holbrooke could never get a one-on-one meeting with the president. Some advisors even tried to get him sacked. In this debilitating state of affairs, Obama seemed to exercise no authority over his own staff. On December 11, 2010, Holbrooke collapsed in Clinton's office with a split aorta and died 2 days later. His friends commented afterward that the infighting had literally killed him. In fact, relations among many leading members of the Obama team dealing with Afghanistan were dysfunctional. In Kabul, the U.S. Commander General Stanley McChrystal and the head of Central Command General David Petraeus were barely on speaking terms with the U.S. Ambassador Carl Eikenberry. Eikenberry and Ann Patterson, the U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan, were not speaking with Holbrooke. In the Pentagon, the uniformed military differed with civilian bureaucrats on policy issues. All these differences, and Obama's refusal to face up to them, were well known to Afghan and Pakistani leaders, and to the NATO officials who exploited them. The lack of presidential control and the open infighting, in particular Obama's snub of Holbrooke, demoralized America's allies, who were having a hard enough time keeping their publics on board for the war effort. U.S. allies around the world asked what degree of personal commitment the president actually had toward Afghanistan. For a decade, the country had been one of America's biggest foreign policy challenges. For all his misplaced ideological moorings, Bush had understood this when it came to protecting and projecting his wars. He cultivated a common touch, constantly meeting Afghans, students, women, teachers, journalists, filmmakers, or members of parliament, hosting them at the White House and asking them about their problems. His wife, Laura, played a major role in helping reopen the destroyed Afghan school system in 2002, raising education levels and later raising funds for an American university in Kabul. She traveled frequently to Kabul on her own. The couple seemed interested in and involved with Afghanistan. By contrast, I never heard of Obama connecting with any group of Afghans, or hosting any significant groups of Afghan civil society in the White House, or telling stories of Afghans he had met, or in any way personalizing what the war meant to him. Michelle Obama traveled the world and promoted her favorite interests involving women and children and health, but sadly none were related to Afghanistan's women and children. And Afghans noticed that, too. In his speeches, Obama always described the war in the coldest geopolitical terms or in troop numbers, never personalizing his comments, refusing to become emotional or show any passion whatsoever. He visited Kabul as rarely as possible. He failed to describe Afghan realities to the American public or to connect with the Afghan people. He may have been frustrated and disillusioned with Karzai, but such feelings should not have extended to 30 million Afghans and the American troops fighting for them. After meeting him, I had enormous personal expectations of the man and, frankly, when it came to his handling of Afghanistan, I was deeply disappointed. Undoubtedly, Karzai presented an enormous problem for Obama. Once the darling of the West and a moderate, reasonable leader who seemed to have a good chance of taking Afghanistan out of 30 years of war, Karzai had lost his way. He had been in power and isolated in the presidency for too long. Over the course of the decade, the few U.S. and international officials whom Karzai had trusted moved on, leaving the Afghan president alone with his conspiracy theories. During the 2009 presidential election, he was convinced that the Americans wanted to get rid of him, even as he stubbornly refused to correct his own failures. Corruption in the top ranks of his government and family and his own lack of vision. He frequently told top U.S. officials that of the three main enemies he faced, the United States, the international community, and the Taliban, he would side first with the Taliban. It was hardly a statement to win over Western soldiers who were living and dying battling the Taliban. Throughout Afghan history, the hallmark of each ruler's psyche has been an overriding concern for his own political and physical survival. No recent Afghan ruler has died peacefully in his bed. U.S. diplomats of an earlier generation understood the implications, that building trust required more than just money and guns. In a prescient 1972 report, filed months before the last Afghan king, Mohammad Zahir Shah, was deposed in a coup, U.S. Ambassador Robert Newman wrote, "For the king and leadership group, survival is the first objective with all other goals considered secondary. The result is an excessively cautious governing style which invariably seeks to balance off external and internal forces perceived as threatening the regime's power." The same could be said of Karzai today. Handling a wary president preoccupied with keeping his own head requires a personal touch, something that Obama never extended. The Americans had themselves to blame for the lack of a trusting relationship with Karzai. After 2001, Western leaders had pledged never to abandon Afghanistan, but their commitments of money and manpower never matched their rhetoric. Sufficient funds to rebuild the country's infrastructure and economy never arrived, and the United States refused to deploy troops outside Kabul after the 2001 invasion, instead rearming, over Karzai's objections, the warlords who ruled the provinces like medieval barons. The shift of U.S. resources and attention from Afghanistan to Iraq led to bitterness. During this period, I met Karzai every few months, and with each meeting, his complaint grew louder. Washington was failing to help provide electricity, build roads, and rehabilitate 3 million returning refugees. U.S. resources had long been squandered in contracts for the military and civilian infrastructure. The full facts emerged only during the Obama administration. The Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, set up by Congress in 2008, reported that waste and fraud had affected $30 billion worth of contracts in the two countries, all of which had undermined U.S. diplomacy, fostered corruption, and tarnished the American image abroad. The United States has deployed more than 260,000 contractors, or the same number as U.S. troops, to both countries. Karzai had repeatedly pointed out to Bush Pakistan's clandestine support of the Taliban. Bush declined to do anything about it. Yet Karzai remained intensely loyal to Bush, who, despite his failings, made an effort to maintain close personal ties with the Afghan leader. He would video conference with Karzai often. Obama arrived in office giving no sign of wanting to have a personal relationship with Karzai. He cancelled the video conferences and issued a laundry list of issues that Karzai had to address: nepotism and corruption in the Afghan government, lack of good governance, and the proliferating drug trade. These were right things to ask for, but Obama asked for them in the wrong way. None of Obama's senior advisers had any experience with Afghanistan, and Karzai felt deeply insecure, as he knew nobody in Washington and nobody was making an effort to get to know him. He feared that Obama was out to replace him, and so began to fear for his own political survival. Karzai was full of conspiracy theories about the Americans, which he would air to me regularly. According to one of them, the reason the United States would not deal decisively with Pakistan was that it was in league with Pakistan to weaken Afghanistan. From Karzai's perspective, Washington treated him with a mixture of insult and confusion. During Obama's December 2010 visit to the U.S. troops at Bagram airfield, bad weather prevented him from flying by helicopter to nearby Kabul. Rather than wait for the weather to clear, a matter of hours perhaps, Obama left without seeing Karzai. It was a snub for the Afghans. Karzai considered the Americans hopelessly fickle, with multiple military and civilian envoys carrying contradictory messages, working at cross purposes, and waging Washington turf battles in his drawing room. Unfortunately, the U.S. president who would try to do the most for Afghanistan militarily and economically would be the most reviled in Kabul. Karzai got along with none of Obama's officials except for General Stanley McChrystal, who showed deference to him in decision-making and treated Karzai's criticism of U.S. military tactics with respect and thoughtfulness. When McChrystal was forced to resign in July 2010 over his comments in a magazine article, Karzai begged the White House not to sack him. They refused to listen. Karzai thought this was another conspiracy by Obama to sack the only friend he had made. The WikiLeaks revelations and Bob Woodward's unflattering portrait of Karzai in Obama's Wars, based on official U.S. perceptions, the book said the CIA believed Karzai to be manic-depressive, were the last straw. He believed every word he read. Karzai was his own worst enemy. He had refused to address any of the demanding issues that engulfed his administration. He failed to accept that corruption was a core problem for the country and his people. He showed little interest in improving governance and capacity in his ministries. He rarely visited the army or the bureaucracy in training. He could not say no to his brothers, who fleeced the banks and were involved in multiple property acquisitions. He mixes the enemy in place of a friend in place of the enemy, and confuses the nation, said former presidential candidate Abdullah Abdullah. Ultimately, Karzai failed himself and his country. In Washington, the real debate was not over Karzai, but over whether to conduct a counterinsurgency campaign, which would require tens of thousands of troops, or a counterterrorism campaign, which would involve fewer troops but rely on drones, missiles, and surveillance to take out extremists. In 2009 and again in 2010, the military won out on obtaining more troops to do counterinsurgency. Based on the maxim, clear, hold, build, and transfer to the Afghans, counterinsurgency was meant to be people-centric, winning over Afghan peasants, protecting them from the Taliban, and rebuilding their lives. Obama's message to McChrystal was, "Don't clear and hold what you can't transfer. Don't overextend us." The Afghans were barely consulted in these internal negotiations, and the Pakistanis even less so. Both governments grew increasingly bitter as the Americans came to them with done deals. While carrying out counterinsurgency, the U.S. military was also secretly conducting counterterrorism, which Vice President Biden had advocated. U.S. Special Operations Forces carried out night raids, killing or capturing hundreds of Taliban commanders and fighters, but civilians were also inadvertently dying. The CIA's drone strikes in Afghanistan and in Pakistan's tribal areas were also part of this secret counterterrorism war, and they caused even more civilian casualties, which ultimately increased anti-Americanism in both countries. General McChrystal, who became chief of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan in June 2009, had for 5 years led the Joint Special Operations Command, which conducted the night raids. Night raids were intensified, while Petraeus, as head of CENTCOM, pushed the White House for more troops. In his first report in August 2009, McChrystal boldly wrote of the possibility that the United States would lose the war by 2010 and of the high risk of strategic defeat in the region. He was the first U.S. general to publicly admit that a Taliban shadow government actively seeks to control the population and displace the national government and traditional power structures. McChrystal's shocking report made it easier for the Pentagon to ask Obama for more troops. But the White House was bewildered because it thought it had already provided the necessary number of troops. It had dispatched 17,000 just 4 months earlier. The generals were now loudly talking of the aim of defeating the Taliban rather than disrupting and degrading them. This was far from Obama's original mission statement. The military seemed once again to be boxing Obama into a corner and taking control of the narrative. Starting in September 2009, over several weeks, Obama conducted a long assessment of his options. The military wanted Obama to consider only 3: dispatching 10,000 trainers, sending 40,000 troops, or sending 85,000 troops. Once again, there was little discussion of Afghanistan's strategic political issues, such as its growing political and ethnic divisions, its economy, relations with Karzai, or the readiness of the Taliban for talks. Pakistan occupied a lot of discussion, but yielded few political answers. Instead, Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, presented a list of clandestine counterterrorism operations that the CIA wanted to conduct in Pakistan, such as stepping up drone attacks, raising the number of CIA agents and covert contractors, and even setting up a parallel intelligence organization that would be hidden from the ISI. The CIA's recommendations were accepted, but they soon led to a complete breakdown of relations with Pakistan. Once again, missing from the White House debates were in-depth consultations with Pakistani and Afghan leaders. Both the Pakistani and the Afghan governments resented the fact that a major U.S. escalation of troops was being undertaken without consulting them or soliciting their views. Instead, for the Americans, what consultations meant was sending senior officials to Kabul and Islamabad for just 2 days to listen to the other side. On November 11th, Obama sent a letter to President Asif Ali Zardari proposing a long-term strategic partnership that would deepen the relationship, but also warning that support for the Taliban would no longer be tolerated. Zardari's reply, which ignored Obama's points, spoke of the threat to Pakistan presented by India. The two countries were talking past each other. American voices were also ignored. Richard Holbrooke and his team, as well as Carl Eikenberry, the U.S. ambassador to Kabul, who had written a long cable expressing his reservations about a counterinsurgency strategy that relies on a large infusion of U.S. forces. The Pentagon shoved both men into the background. On November 25, 2009, in a major speech at West Point, Obama announced his decision to enact the surge. He said he would send 30,000 more troops, but would start to bring them back in July 2011, when a transition to Afghan forces would begin. The July date, added at the last minute by White House aides without conferring with the State Department or the Pentagon, led to consternation in the region. The plan was poorly explained by Obama. All the regional countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and India, and the Taliban, understood it to mean that the United States was on the way out, and that the endgame had begun. They began to flex their muscles for future influence in Afghanistan. Obama emerged from the speech as vacillating and contrarian. He was flexing American muscle, then stopping short by putting a time limit to the surge. He insisted that any pullout be conditions-based, but then gave an actual pullout date. He was going on the offensive, but then announcing when that offensive